This is Ed Petke with the Americans in Wartime Experience. Today's date is November 12th, 2022, and I'm conducting an interview with Harold McDougal in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Sir, can you tell us your name and where you were born?
Harold Douglas McDougal, California, Merced, California.
And what war did you participate in?
I'm sorry?
What war did you participate in?
Vietnam War. Yeah.
You have any other military veterans in your family?
My father was actually in World War II. He was an aircraft mechanic in B-29s.
Okay, awesome. So European theater?
Yes, yeah.
And what branch of the military did you serve in?
I served in the Air Force.
Why did you enter into military service?
Well, I was pretty close to being drafted, and I decided I'd like to have a choice. So I decided I would like to go in the Air Force. I'd like to see a little bit of the country.
So you enlisted or you were commissioned?
I was commissioned.
Okay, so you had already been in college by this time?
I had a couple of years at college, but I went into what was called the Aviation Cadet Program, and I was slated to go into pilot training, but I had a issue with my vision, so I elected to go into navigational training, and eventually went into also bombardier training.
Okay. So that program, is that essentially kind of what ROTC is for high school, would be for college?
Well, the Aviation Cadet Program is no longer done, but this is something out of World War II where they trained officers for pilot, navigator, bombardier.
Okay.
It was kind of like a aviation cadet. It was I think it seemed like it was about a 9-month program to get a commission, basically.
And what kind of duties or what kind of things would you do in this program?
Cadet training, if you would, military and then academic also for navigational.
Okay. So rules and regs, formalities.
But navigational training.
Okay,
and,
so you actually got hands-on training with the equipment?
We flew.
You did fly, okay.
Yeah.
And this is
training to become an officer also.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is obviously with, you go into this program with the anticipation that you're going to go active duty.
Well, no, I was in active duty.
You were?
I was active duty in the Aviation Cadet Program.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then at the end of it, I received a commission.
Okay.
So it's a cadet program.
So what rank would you have been when you entered?
Second lieutenant. Well, I mean, I was an aviation cadet until I was commissioned. Then I was commissioned as a second lieutenant.
Second lieutenant. And what year would that have been?
This was about December 60.
1960.
Yeah, 61 maybe. So I actually served active about 5 years.
Okay.
So about 60 to 65, and then reserve after that for a number of years.
Okay. So your first part of being active duty, you were stateside?
Yes, all of it, yes.
And where did you...
well, this was, we were in Harlingen, Texas, where, the Aviation Cadet Program went through. And then bombardier training was in California at Mather Air Force Base after I was commissioned.
Okay. So bombardier training, that's actually being up in the plane, hitting the button, bomb days.
This was actually training to become a bombardier and probably headed to SAC for B-52s, and I elected not to. I had a choice depending on, or based on the standing in class, that I decided I'd go into tactical air command rather than the strategic air command.
The difference being?
Well, I didn't want to sit out on the, prairie somewhere, on alert with a B-52. Right. I'd rather be able to fly, so I went into C-130s. Okay. So we pretty much travel the world.
So you'd rather be in the air than on the ground
sitting out,
it.
Right.
Understood. So from Texas, where do you go from there?
Well, after I went through bombardier training, and then from there I went into the tactical air command and went to Nashville, Tennessee, Stewart Air Force Base, and that's really where I picked up the C-130s and started training there, and flew out of there for probably a year or so. And before I got into Vietnam, actually I was second or a first lieutenant, and I went on. I was on leave, and actually they sent the. I was an instructor navigator by that time. I had a lot of overwater navigation training. So I was an instructor navigator at the time, and a lot of flying of Central and South America, Europe, and they were getting ready to ferry a flight of 6 C-123s. I was in 4-engine C-130s, and C-123 is a twin-engine cargo airdrop.
And these are jet engines?
No. This is prop.
Okay.
Yeah, and completely different. There was no overwater navigation in these C-123 aircraft, so they really needed an experienced overwater navigator. So that's how I came in, because I had a lot of experience in navigational training.
Okay. And the reason, what was the reason why they didn't have a lot of overwater stuff? No need, or just no?
Well, the C-123s was an assault cargo where they do paratroopers, and it was mainly over land.
Right.
But they needed those aircraft to support things that were going on in Vietnam at that point. And it turned out we were really supporting Air America at that point. And I was not even aware of that until I was on vacation. I actually was on leave, and the sheriff showed up at the door, and I said, "Hey, you need to be back at your base in pretty quick."
Okay.
So within the next couple of days, I was on a flight of 6 C-123s as the lead navigator heading towards Vietnam.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this would have been a time before the U.S. was really fully involved, or even they were maybe marginally involved?
Well, this was not something that was classified at the time.
Right.
Yeah. So, but Air America, who was supporting the Strategic Hamlet project, later we found out, where they were forming villages on mountaintops and whatever, and they had to support them, and it was growing so fast that Air America could just not take care of all this. So they determined that the C-123 was the aircraft, and we had a fair number of them, was what they needed, because we were supporting these. The strategic hamlets were on mountaintops, or they may have had a runway or not, so there was a lot of airdrop involved. So that's exactly what the C-123 was good at. So, and we also dropped paratroopers 3 or 4 times initially.
So for somebody who may not be familiar with what Air America was, can you explain that a little
Air
bit?
America was really a transport of the CIA. Yeah.
So getting in there beforehand and getting a grip and a grasp in country to further U.S. involvement.
Right.
But obviously, like you said, at the time, you had no idea.
I had no
Or
idea.
you were even involved with it.
Right.
Which I'm sure by design,
I
that
mean, my
was the plan.
principal job was to ferry 6 aircraft over there, and we did. The only issue, the C-123 aircraft was really not made to fly over water. And we had no oxygen, and which means we couldn't fly over about 12,000 feet. And so we had some real issues of overcast, and I mean, we're talking about sextant and navigation with no
Old school.
GPS, and this is Columbus at the best.
Sure.
So it was interesting, but obviously we made it.
So was this the first time you'd ever been out of the States?
No. At this point, I had a lot of experience of flying C-130s in Central and South America.
Okay.
Because I was flying C-130s for at least a year or two,
And
I was an instructor navigator by that time, so I had a lot of navigational experience.
Now, was that official duties down in South and Central America, or was that training?
No, that was official. This was C-130s, and we were actually supplying military missions all over Central and South America. We would stage down there, flying out of the Canal Zone for 2 months at a time. So I spent probably 9 months in Central and South America over a period of a couple of years.
Did you know who you were supporting at the time?
You could figure it out.
Yeah. Just based on reading the news and who's fighting who and who's...
Right. There's a lot going on down there.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So as what are your duties on the plane?
Well, I'm the navigational officer. Determines where you're going, when you're going to get there, the route, and that sort of thing.
Okay. You plot out the course and all that good kind of stuff?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Mm-hmm. Because if you're flying for, you might be flying for 6 or 10 hours, depending on where you're going. You've got to determine how to get there. But it's all pre-planned. You do a lot of planning, but a lot of it was sextant and old school navigation, because GPS was not, satellites and all that was not there. So
plus, you're in the middle of the ocean. You're not going to pick anything up
exactly.
Anyway. There's no landmarks.
It's all, observation of stars and celestial bodies.
And certain headings and certain bearings.
Exactly. It's dead reckoning and navigation. A la Columbus.
And then, wow, we made it.
Well,
sometimes
we always made it.
Yeah, good. Well, good. That's awesome.
But that's really why I was selected. Plus, I was a bachelor also, and I was kind of volunteered. They needed somebody quickly to navigate and lead. I was a lead navigator also for the C-123s to get them over there, because we started ferrying. I'm not sure if we were the first 6, but we were probably maybe the first or the second. I'm not really sure. So 6 of these C-123 aircraft with rubber bladders of fuel in the back. They were not really designed to go over water, but we had enough. I think to Hawaii took us about 12 or 13 hours. We would have been in trouble if we'd lost an engine. So it was pretty tight.
So when you went over to
we actually flew into Da Nang.
Okay.
So when we landed at Da Nang, the only thing I can recall, there was an old Japanese hangar. There were no tents or barracks, and we actually set up tents on wooden pallets when we were first there, and I think we stayed at Da Nang for probably a month or so, and flew out of there. And then eventually, as things became more organized, we moved down to Tansanut, or near Saigon, and lived in a tent there for a while. And then eventually we were able to, actually a group of us got together, and we had an apartment downtown, and then we would go back to the base to fly and stand watch. So we flew, I guess I probably flew maybe 70 combat support missions during that period. We dropped paratroopers 3 times. These were Vietnamese. And theoretically we were there for training, but obviously we were doing other things.
Sure. Well, what were your first impressions of Vietnam when you first landed there?
The smell, for one thing, it was different. But we were actually
describe the smell as?
Different.
Just different.
it was something that is in the U.S. you don't smell. It's just in the tropics it's just a different thing. But we were one of the interesting parts. We were. There's a lot of these strategic hamlets don't have refrigeration or electricity, so fresh food, which are either ducks, pigs, chickens, cattle, rice, had to come in, constantly to support them. So basically, our major mission was supplying food and weapons also, because we carried in airdrop weapons occasionally, but so basically food.
At this point, you're supporting the South Vietnamese.
Correct. That is correct. Yeah. Well, that and whoever else who else was there. Yeah.
Right. Air America and
correct. Yeah. Right.
So you mentioned you had some few combat operations.
Well, we actually flew 70 combat support missions, and we did 3 airdrops, but the rest of it was supporting, combat operations, whether it was things that were going on, or supplying, some of these strategic hamlets that may have been under stress.
Right. So you're not seeing American troops.
No.
At this point.
No. I mean, we would fly. We would get shot at a little bit, but we tried to, if we could, going out over the water. If we were going north, we would fly out over the water a little bit and just go along the coast. But so we flew up and down the coast quite a bit rather than fly over the jungle, depending on what we were doing. But we flew a lot of missions into little hilltops, or maybe I flew into several, dirt runways. The C-123 was set up to fly on just about anywhere,
Okay.
but usually on most of it was airdrop, or if they had an airfield. But most of it was on hilltops, so they were not airfields around.
Right. So you were aiming for a specific spot.
We would
like
actually
those.
drop, usually parachute, but sometimes just sacks of rice.
Okay.
But usually, in this Air America movie, the movie was pretty close of a lot of that, because we could drop, pigs, but they were in baskets with a parachute on them, so they wouldn't smash them.
Right, right.
But it was kind of interesting.
But,
But if that was fresh food, we provided fresh food, and also ammunition. We would airdrop ammunition.
so they were pretty reliant on us. As
Well,
far as,
they wouldn't have been able to
right.
sustain it without us.
So had you not been there doing your missions and dropping, would you anticipate that? Would that have pushed us in earlier? Would you think that the South Vietnamese wouldn't have sustained us?
Possibly. Mhm.
Okay. When you when you would fly these missions, how long would a typical flight mission? Was there a typical flight mission? Or
Not really, because
you always take off in the same spot, same area.
well, it would either. Most of the time, we were starting after a couple of months flying out of Tan Son Nhut, but we actually might fly over to Thailand, and but without crossing Cambodia
Sure,
or
sure.
whatever. But up and down, all the way up to Da Nang and down and back to Tan Son Nhut. It might be 2 or 3 hours. Maybe a little longer,
Okay.
but just depends on what we had to do. But typically, we were support for these little strategic hamlets that were located on, everything from a mountaintop to maybe near a little runway. But it seemed like the vast majority of it was airdrop.
Okay. Had you ever? Would you ever get any kind of feedback or any kind of after action reports to say, yeah, your stuff got where it needed to go, it didn't?
Well, a couple of times we got something. We dropped a couple of sacks of rice through one of the buildings. They were not too happy about that, but things happen.
Yeah. It got to
It
the
got
ground,
there.
right?
It got there. But typically, they were on parachutes.
Okay. So would you say that you would? I mean, at the time you may not have known, but had you learned subsequently? Did any of your missions take you outside the borders of Vietnam proper?
Yes.
Okay. Got it. Now, the Air America portion of the CIA portion of it, did you have any direct communication with them, or you got orders from somewhere? It was an intermediary?
We
You ever
really
worked
didn't.
side by side with them?
We went through our chain of command pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you didn't know who they were at the time?
No, I knew a little
Okay.
bit. Yeah.
You
Actually,
knew without officially knowing, maybe?
right. I got in with some of them.
Okay.
They supplied me with a weapon.
Okay. So were you not meant to be armed at the time?
Well, most people were armed, but it was obviously we tried to avoid situations.
Right.
People would shoot at you occasionally, but when you're flying over, whether you were armed or not, it probably was a good idea in case you
Sure.
went down, because we lost some aircraft.
Did your aircraft ever have to ditch or go down or anything?
No. We had a few bullet holes once in a while, but nothing serious. We did search for a couple of aircraft, but we never found them. It just, when you close in on the jungle, it just closes up.
Thick and
It
dense
just you just could not find. Yeah. So, but we had a few little. One of the issues I remember one time we took off out of Tan Son Nhut, and we were carrying bombs in the back, and they were not. They were. I think they were like probably about 250-pound bombs, and they were just held down with. They couldn't be jettisoned, and we lost an engine. So I think we actually had an engine fire. We were able to put it out, and we could not dump these bombs, so we had to turn around and land on one engine, which was kind of
A little dicey.
little severe.
And obviously, you know what you're carrying.
Right,
So at
right.
the time, you're like,
Yeah,
we can't go down.
right. So that was probably one of the closer calls that I had.
Were most of your missions were they daytime, nighttime, mixture? of both?
Daytime.
Mostly daytime.
Yeah.
Just so you could navigate by sight.
Right. Well, you had to find these places, so
Okay.
it was principally daytime. We dropped paratroopers 3 times that I can recall. We did have air support, probably Vietnamese,
Okay.
I think. But I think after a while, probably the dropping of paratroops were probably not all that effective when you're chasing VCs in the jungle.
No.
So eventually we just supplied these strategic hamlets.
Okay. Would you ever have any of the South Vietnamese on the planes with you?
No.
So it was just strictly
us.
just
Right.
American.
Well, I shouldn't say that. They were in the back. We had a loadmaster, and then they were support to help
Okay.
in the dropping of the. So they in that way there were Vietnamese on board. Yes.
But not involved in the intricate
No, not
the planning, the
no,
flying,
no,
the
not no,
navigation.
No, they were just helping.
Okay. And I'm sure that they were quite appreciative of your efforts.
Well, it kept people alive
Yeah.
because there were no refrigeration, so it was all fresh meat, fresh, rice, and that's basically how they survived.
Right. Were you able to readily keep in touch with folks back home?
Yes, it was pretty standard through our chain of command. Yeah.
Okay. So you were able to let them know you're okay without divulging
Right,
what was
right,
actually
right,
going
right.
on. Okay. So how would a typical rotation? I mean, would you fly a certain number of days and have a break, or was it just basically as needed type of a thing? Would you have a schedule?
Well, we had an apartment. There were 4 or 5 of us that rented an apartment down in Saigon, and we would come out to the base and stay in a tent for a couple of days, fly our missions, and then go back. But usually it was we were flying probably every other day.
Okay.
So over a period of I was there 6 months because with 179 days. Which was not a PCS or a permanent change of station, and
Right.
that was, I guess, for political reasons. And so 70 combat support missions would have been every other day probably, because usually a mission was could be a couple hours to several, depending on what we were doing, how
Right.
far we had to go.
What you were carrying.
Right,
stuff. Okay.
right.
So would you ever go out and have multiple drop locations?
Yes,
Or?
yeah. We could be carrying. I can remember one time we had a load of weapons, and it looked like a lot of these were from World War II, and they were just a pile of them with a cargo net over the top of it, and that's what we were doing. When we first landed in Da Nang, set up our tent, I can recall hanging from the ceiling all kinds of weapons from World War II. I'm not sure where it all came from, but it could be MP40s. They were Matson machine guns. I saw all kinds of things, and I presume these came from the CIA.
Okay.
Yeah.
And but they were just happy to get whatever they could get.
Well, these were actually the crews. These were crew. These
Oh.
were crew members.
Okay.
So evidently that was available. Eventually, I picked up something too.
Okay. It's probably a lot easier to get them under the radar to you guys than
Right.
having to go through channels
right.
of real.
Now we could be issued a pistol or like an M2 carbine if you wanted it, but
Right.
people elected to carry whatever they wanted to carry.
Sure. I get
Things were pretty loose.
There any you mentioned the weapons, the bombs. Any cargo that really stands out? Like, man, I can't believe we're dropping this, or anything weird.
Well, when
strange?
you drop a cow, that's kind of unusual. A cow, but
Cow.
usually they're in a like a wooden cage with
Uh-huh.
a parachute, or a pig, or a big basket of chickens, or it was fresh food,
Right,
because
yeah.
they didn't have refrigeration, and they double bagged the bags of rice. If we dropped them without a parachute, typically the rice may have been dropped without a parachute, but sometimes they put parachutes on them. And but I mean, you had to hit a small portion, because
Right.
if it hit out of the bounds of the area, then the VC would pick them up.
Okay.
So
Are these usually low level, slow drops?
fairly well, maybe 300 or 400 feet, 500
Okay.
feet,
Right.
but enough for the parachute to take effect
Okay.
before it hit.
Gotcha. Any incidents that really stand out in your mind?
Other than the cargo of 200-pound or 250-pound bombs and the engine fire, that was probably the closest call that I had. Occasional bullet holes, and that's one of the reasons we flew out over the ocean, was to avoid, fire.
They didn't have a Navy presence, really.
No, nothing.
Air superiority was
no,
ours.
No, yes, that's correct.
So you're just basically worried about
Usually
what's coming.
we would have if we were flying an airdrop, parachute type paratroops, we would have a fighter with us,
Okay.
a prop fighter.
Prop fighter.
Yeah,
And this would have been a Vietnamese.
I suspect it may have been Vietnamese. Yeah, but we only did, I think, 3 of those airdrops, and we would probably have 6 to 12 C-123s involved. It was impressive, but I'm not sure how effective it was. I don't know.
Yeah, no. But so mostly you're dropping gear, food.
Right. Yeah, that was our principal objective, was supplying the strategic hamlets on. I think it may have been called Mule Train, or there were some synonyms.
So, did you have a defined? Hey, you're going to be here from this time to this time.
Yes, it was
so
on
you
my.
knew when you were going.
It was actually on my set of orders. I was
Okay.
there for 179 days, and as a classified training mission.
Okay.
So
It's a long training mission.
Right.
So when your time is coming close, what's the feeling of, hey, my time is coming to a close?
Well, at the very beginning, when I was involved, it got worse after I left. And C-123 started, or a lot of this was taken over by C-130s. Now, I never rotated over there in C-130s because I was doing other things.
Right.
But when I went back, then I went back to my squadron and continued on with what the squadron requirements.
So when you left after your 6-month rotation, where did you come back to?
Well, while I was over there, my squadron moved from Nashville, Tennessee, Seward Air Force Base to Langley, which was in Virginia, which is just over in Newport News, or Hampton, I guess. And actually, I flew out of there, and then from there I flew to Central and South America, or Europe. I spent a few months in Europe. We flew all over, from Oslo, Norway, to Africa, to Turkey, to all over there. We were supplying military missions.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
And
So
the same
they-
thing in Central and South America.
So you're still in that.
This was in the
support role.
C1. This was a 4-engine C-130.
Okay.
Yeah, and
A little bit different than what you were in
Different.
over in Vietnam.
different, entirely different. Yeah.
Different as far as navigating, or different as far as obviously you have a bigger payload?
Entirely different. Entirely different. Yeah, because we were flying airwaves, and we were in the system.
Right. Okay.
Flying in Vietnam, there was no system.
No. So I mean,
Not then anyway.
you
we were pretty much
essentially-
on your own.
Were you essentially out there on your own?
Yes. Yeah.
So, was there a contingency if one of your planes did go down? What was your support? What was your
Well,
backup?
I presume it would have been Army, helicopters and the like. There was a fair contingent there of other.
They had already been coming in.
Right,
Okay.
right.
Okay. Just not the full ramped up.
We did do a couple of searches, but we never really found. I think we lost while I was there, maybe 1 or 2 C-123s. But
So when you got back from Vietnam, you flew your other missions. How much longer did you stay in?
I stayed a total of 5 years active. Left as a captain And I stayed in the reserve. I flew in the reserve, but then I got out and used the GI Bill. Eventually ended up with a doctorate, and I came back to. This was in the. I went to receive my doctorate through the University of California, Davis, the medical school, and then came back and helped start Eastern Virginia Medical School down in Norfolk. Actually, I gave one of the first stand-up lectures to 20 medical students. Wow. So it was quite a different.
Yeah.
And I stayed there for. I was on the faculty. I was associate professor in the Department of Anatomy. I taught neuroanatomy, and I was in charge of the microscopic anatomy. I stayed on the faculty there for 12 years, then eventually started a business of my own, London Bridge Trading, which was we're government contractors and design and fabrication of tactical equipment.
Very cool.
Which we're still in business.
You're still in business?
Still in business, yeah, after 40 years.
Where did the interest in medicine come in? Had you always had that, or was it?
Yes, did a lot of research. I was really involved in a lot of research. I did my doctoral thesis on a lot of the neurotoxins that came out of Germany, and eventually did a lot of electron microscope studies, with doctoral thesis, and continued that when I was at the medical school. But just things change.
Yeah, absolutely.
And basically, that's the only job other than the military. The medical school was the only job I ever had, and then from there I went in business for myself. So we've had upwards of 500 people working for us, but we still have probably 300 or 400.
Outstanding.
But things change.
They do.
You just have to be flexible.
That is the key. Especially being in the military, you learn that in the military.
Right.
Orders are only orders until they're not, until you have other orders.
Right.
So
and you have to adapt.
You don't ever bank on one thing. You don't
Correct.
and that, I'm sure, served you well in later life.
I enjoyed what I did in the military, and it really was an education that I learned a lot. I was glad to serve.
Amen. So, a follow-up to that: how has your wartime experience affected your life?
I have no issues, if that's what you mean. No, I'm healthy.
Has it?
Well, but I was not in a really, a shooting situation where people were trying to kill me all the time. Even though it was dangerous, but it was different. It's a different. Yeah.
Understood. Being in the military, it puts you in a frame of mind.
I think everybody should be, just from experience. It was very educational, and I went back obviously and ended up with higher degrees, but it really helped form the foundation of my life.
Sure. And what translates from military life translates to civilian life, regimented.
It's all based on people.
Absolutely. You learn how to read people. You learn respect. You learn chain of command.
Exactly. It's all good.
And it definitely serves you well. So we're sitting down here today talking in this RV here. I'm recording this. So theoretically, your 20th removed grandchildren are going to watch this video one day.
Right.
What's one thing you would want them to know about your military service and your time over in Vietnam?
Well, it was serving my country, I guess. It was a way to give back, which I think is important. Everybody needs to be involved in that in some way. It's not all free, so to speak.
Right. So just to take a step back for a second, the 60s, you basically had almost two camps. You had the camp of the people who went, the young people who went your direction to serve their country, and you had the vastly different side. How do you wrestle with that back in those days? Being a young person,
that's part of freedom, I guess. But I was early on, and I didn't see that, which was later. When you came back, came back and melted right in.
Okay.
I didn't have any issues with that.
Because that's another thing. I mean, you hear about a lot of these guys who were returning from Vietnam, and they had very bad experiences. In
Very
their
bad
homecoming.
experience, and I was fortunate we didn't have that. We flew back commercial, and
Okay. And you was, I guess,
I was in uniform, but it was
right.
it was
still early enough.
It was too early that was not a problem at that point.
Any thoughts on that dynamic?
Not really.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about that we didn't talk about? Or I didn't ask you about your time in the service or post-service or anything else? That
My
you'd like to
time in the
document?
service was positive. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot. It helped form a good portion of my life. So it was important.
Outstanding. Okay. Well, Mr. McDougal, I'd like to thank you for your service on behalf of myself and the Americans in Wartime Experience.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you for sitting down and speaking with us today. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.